right.
Nice to meet you guys.
Okay, let's go.
My name's Randy Lobono. I'm a full-time multi-species guide, so I guide kind of all around the Midwest, a lot in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. The species I target kind of just depend upon the time of year, or if I have clients that are looking to kind of learn a specific body of water, at a certain time, specific species. So with that, I kind of grew up doing fishing all over and chasing which bite was the hottest for that time of year. So it kind of went hand in hand with me doing all this multi-species guiding. Yeah. It went hand in hand with my multi-species guiding, so I learned a ton of different species at a ton of different times of year and kind of utilize that as my job now. I also, now that I've advanced and started fishing more and more as I've gotten older, I do a little bit of tournament fishing, nothing crazy national-wise, just a lot of the local English choice tournaments. I'll fish mainly the Fox Chain and the Lake Geneva ACs are the two main ones that I fish. And right now, all I can really think about is pre-spawn smallmouth. This time of year, I'm doing a lot of guiding for brown trout and steelhead. I actually just drove from a guide trip in Kenosha. We were doing brown trout today, and they're a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong, I love them. They're probably one of my favorite fish at target, but I've been doing them since last October, so I'm kind of have that itch to start smallmouth fishing now. So that's all I can really think about. So it's kind of the perfect topic for today for us to talk about. And do you guys do a lot of smallmouth fishing around this area, or anyone fish on Lake Geneva?
Triangular?
Yeah, that's the thing with Lake Geneva. That's why when I was talking with him, it's kind of a good topic for a lot of places that I've gone to talk, because it's an incredible fishery, but it also can be challenging at times too. It changes a lot. Fish can be different one day and completely different the next day. So it's a hard place to learn and kind of understanding, like, not just one specific technique that you're going to go there and rely on, even for just the spring as an example, is having like a variety of techniques depending on how the fish are setting up to kind of help you be productive and rotate through those. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, is all different aspects of ways to target them in the spring specifically. So if you go out there and let's say you always are catching them on a specific plastic that you've gone out there a handful of times and caught them really well on, but it's not working, you're not like, oh, the bite's not good today, I'm not going to catch any fish. Because that's one thing that I've learned a lot as a guide, is the fish are always biting somewhere. It's not your technique's not working, the lake's not good today. It's about adapting to that and fishing the conditions in front of you. So I kind of just talked about a little bit about why smallmouth fishing is special to me. It's a new bite for this time of year, and I'm always looking forward to it, but the bite itself is super special, and you get a lot of bites, which makes it fun, and also they're the biggest smallmouth that you're typically going to catch the whole year. So it's a good combination of quality and quantity that you're getting, which in the summer, like, you can catch big ones for sure, but it's a lot of, you get one bite here and there, it's a good one. It's in the spring, it's hot and heavy with some big fish. Bycatch, I heard this gentleman mention if you like catching walleye. That's the awesome thing, especially on Geneva in the spring. All these fish are setting up in similar areas. So even though this presentation is going to focus more on smallmouth and what I like to throw at them in the spring on Geneva, or any like deep, clear body of water in the spring, it's also going to be similar techniques that you'll be very productive with largemouth and smallmouth as well, not just the smallmouth. And the techniques you use to catch them, everyone has like bait or two that they love to throw to catch fish on. And for me, all of the ones that I throw in the spring are some of my favorite bites that I get throughout the whole year, throwing a jerkbait, a hair jig, a tattletale, which we'll talk about as we go through this, but they're all super fun bites that you get to have. So, I don't know if you guys are hardcore largemouth bass fishermen, but there's kind of like the staples that float around the industry that are typical spring baits for bass fishing. And a lot of it comes from southern reservoirs and southern fisheries where it's more of a largemouth like dominance. And what I've seen with my clients when I take them out pre-spawn smallmouth fishing is they're like, oh, I thought you could throw a but kind of a fishery that's clear, deep, and how Geneva sets up, these baits will catch you a fish or two, but it's not going to be the most productive application. Especially when you look at the screen here too with the red. Like red, everyone knows red is great in the spring. It catches a lot of bass, it triggers a lot of bites, but you have to think in a body of water like Geneva that's super clean, you might get a reaction strike or two from that, but these fish are going to be a little bit more conditioned and smarter to a big, giant, flashy red chatterbait flying by their face. They're not going to want to bite it unless they're super fired up. So to start off, like I said, I want to break this down into a few different categories, so we're going to be able to catch them regardless of what the day throws at us. To start, the most important thing is kind of understanding where to look, because you can have the perfect presentation, perfect color, perfect size, you're fishing at a perfect cadence, but if there's not smallmouth around, it doesn't matter, you're not going to catch them. So a couple things that I like to look at. First, we'll talk about water temperature. Water temperature plays a huge role year-round, depending on, it doesn't matter what species you're targeting or what time of year, but in the spring it's super, super important because these fish are coming from that super cold water and they're gonna notice the littlest, smallest temperature change in that water. So it's gonna bring bait fish as well as those fish, the smallmouth that you're targeting, to that water. So you might be going around the lake and you notice water's 38 pretty much everywhere, you get somewhere it's 39. That may seem like a really, really small difference, but that's going to be a huge difference to these fish. Not only in the sense of it is warmer, but you know now that given the conditions you have for that day, that water is warming up faster than how everything else is. So keeping a mental note of that, where's the wind blowing? How is this setting up? Like, why is this getting warmer? And then if the fish aren't biting there, you can have an idea when you look at your mapping on your boat and kind of see, well, this has wind blowing into it. It's a little bit shallower, it's sand. Look at your map, try to find other stuff like that, and you might be able to find a pattern based on that. The wind, as I just mentioned, it matters quite a bit, the direction and both the speed of it. So in the spring, you can have wind that's blowing into something, and you had a warming trend, and it's going to push warm surface water into that shallower area. So that can be something that you look for. And on the flip side of that, on a cold front or colder surface temperatures, sometimes you can even find the wind that's not like where the wind is blowing from is going to be the warmer water too, because it's pushing some of that colder surface water out and the sun's going to warm that up. The speed, not so much matters in terms of where you're finding the fish always, but it matters in what you're going to choose for your bait selection then. So that's going to be something that is kind of important to understand as we go further into this. Bottom composition kind of goes hand in hand with bait selection as well as the water temperature that you're going to find and where you're going to find these smallmouth. So typically smallmouth, as most people kind of understand, are going to relate to a harder bottom. So if you have something that's sand or rock, that's going to be something that's going to be holding a lot of these smallmouth. While on the flip side of that, sometimes you get some of this. Geneva doesn't get super dirty, but I don't know if any of you guys have been out there after it's been super, super windy in the spring. Sometimes certain areas do get a little bit of a stain to it. I wouldn't call it muddy water, but it'll almost have like a chalky type look to it. And that is areas that have sand, and some of the areas you see that shallow grass, it contains some silts and stuff like that as well on Geneva. And that will cause that water to warm up a little bit as well too. So all of this kind of circles back to water temperature at the end of the day in the spring for me. But kind of understanding how wind and bottom composition play in terms of water temperature is super important. And then the last thing I have on here is more, you have an area you found fish in and you're looking and understanding the structure versus a flat for it. So that's, you're in an area, you're finding fish, not so much the broad picture of it, but where these fish are setting up. Sometimes in the spring you'll find fish that are isolated on structure, and then sometimes they'll be on a flat that contains more bait. So typically, to get into more depth with that in the spring, the colder the water temperature, the more I like to be somewhat near some sort of isolated structure, because these fish are typically going to be deeper coming off those wintering holes. So in that sense, I'm looking for a steep drop that has an area that they're going to come up to in the spring that has a warm flat that's going to hold bait, and they're going to be more related to the structure that's like on that break going into the deep water. So it's a combination of just the time in the spring of understanding if these fish are going to be, that water's warm and warm and warm and then they're pushing up onto that flat, or if it's still cold and they're kind of holding back into that deeper water, waiting to push up and isolating on some of that structure.
Question.
Yes, sir.
At what depths are you testing your water temperatures?
It's a great question. So Geneva is an interesting one because you obviously have some you have some super deep water, and deep water is a very general term. So I appreciate you asking that question because it means different things to different people. So when I'm talking deep water on Geneva, I'm talking in the range of beyond 25 feet. So 25 to 35 is usually a key depth when I'm looking for deeper smallmouth, but sometimes you will even find them in that 40-foot range as well too. But typically that deep water range, when you're finding that the water's cold and they're still pushed off a little bit, they're going to be suspended like right on that break in that 25 to 35 foot range, and it's still going to be kind of adjacent to that shallow water. Whereas when I'm talking shallow, for Geneva, that is deep for some lakes. So the shallow water I'm looking on Geneva is typically like that 10 to 15. That's what I'm going to consider as we talk through this too, like more shallow water. So that's where these smallmouth want to get to ultimately too. Most of these fish, I'm sure you guys, if you've been out on Geneva, you've seen it littered with smallmouth beds around the spawn in May. And these fish, they're all going to go up there. They're all going to push up and spawn. Some of them do stop a little bit deeper, but you have to think they're deep, it's cold, they want to push up, so they're going to be close and adjacent to those areas that they want to spawn in. So, getting them to bite. So, let's say you found an area that has some smallmouth in it, whether you're utilizing like your side imaging, forward-facing sonar, and you found an area that has fish, or you broke down some warmer water, you found something that looks like it should have fish on it, and you want to figure out if those fish are there and I want to bite. I have this broken down into 3 steps for us. Each one we'll kind of go into. The first one is bait selection, because that's the first thing I'm going to do. Before you pick a color, before you pick a size, you have to pick the bait. So the first one I'm going to do is choose my bait, and I'm going to break that down by the bait that's in the area, where I found them, and if there's wind or no wind. That's going to help me kind of determine. So I always kind of categorize it into steps, and it'll give you an array of baits. I brought some of these up here as well. I'll pass them around to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about. So we'll start off with where you found them. So if you found them, the water's colder, they're still setting up deep in that 25 to 35, I'm going to have a different array of baits than I am when they're shallow. So typically when they're deeper like that, it's not going to be as much of a bottom contact deal for myself, so I'm typically going to be throwing more baits that I can kind of get them to rise on or chase at. So a couple examples of that would be, I'm sure you guys have seen the craze with like a jig head minnow. This would be an example if you are going to utilize forward-facing sonar. Not that you can't catch them without it, but it's a lot more applicable with that. So a bait that I will throw in Geneva when I'm finding them deeper and the water's still colder is any type of minnow. I like a depth Sakamata shad. We'll get into the exact baits that I throw, but just to give you an example. So a straight tail minnow and kind of targeting those individual fish on forward-facing sonar. And if you don't have it, even though they're in that deep water, a lot of times they'll be tighter to the bottom. So what I'm going to do is throw that bait out, let it get down to the bottom, and just keep working it back to the boat. Because that's what you're doing when you're working your sonar as well. You're getting them to chase it up and away from you.
What's the predominant big fish?
So in the spring, a lot of these fish are eating tiny, tiny perch. So it's an ongoing debate with all fishermen always matching the hatch. Obviously the color is super important for that, but there's a time and place, different days when having that small bait profile is really important. And sometimes I feel like you get lost in the crowd of all the bait because there's so much bait out there in the spring. We're going up a size, but that kind of natural pattern, everyone sees perch and you get perch colors that are fire tiger and so on, but more of like that natural bait fish pattern imitates a perch, it imitates a lot of different stuff out there. So it's more of a bland type of color typically. So where did we find them? So you found them deep. I'm going to be throwing a bait that's going to get them to kind of chase up more. Baits that are going to pull away from them and get them to kind of react to it a little bit more. If you found them shallow, I'm kind of going to go to more of a bottom contact typically, unless we have fish that are suspended. So most of the time when you find fish that are shallow, that water temperature is touching that like mid 40s to low 50s, like 46 to 48 is kind of a key number that's when they're going to be getting up shallow and kind of feeding pretty good on Geneva. And that's where I'm typically going to go to more of a bottom contact bait. So that's going to be a bait that, a little swim bait, a little football jig, and kind of dragging bottom and maintaining bottom contact with it is going to generate a lot more bites when they're shallow. Wind or no wind, that also goes into the type of bait I'm going to throw. 2 examples for that would be, this would apply for deep and shallow fish. When I'm saying shallow fish, bottom contact, that's not the only bait that you can throw at them. But wind versus no wind, you're going to compare like fish that you're getting to chase that are suspended, a hair jig versus a jerk bait. So slick calm on Geneva, I'm finding fish that are kind of not wanting to play too much. They're either not hitting a bottom contact bait or they're just suspended up, and you can tell when you're fishing it, they're not going to chase that on the bottom. That's when I'll pick up a hair jig and kind of just slow wind that bait past them. Whereas that same situation, and it's not slick calm and wind's blowing into that area, that's where you're going to pick up a jerk bait. So it's kind of, that's my favorite example to give people, where it's one bait may shine in that with the wind, that jerk bait throwing it around, and the hair jig will shine when it's flat calm, and you try to intermix that and you're not going to catch them on the flip side. So step 2 kind of goes to your question about bait fish. So choosing the color and the size. So Geneva's typically going to have a pretty clean watercolor in general, and same in the terms of depth. Like it's going to be dirty in terms of Geneva. So Geneva doesn't typically get a crazy amount of color in it, but in the spring is one of the times you can start to see some color. So with that, I'm going to always err on the side of a more natural presentation, regardless of what bait I'm throwing, whether it be a jerk bait, a swim bait, or a jig. But if there's a little bit of color in the water, and I almost consider the wind sometimes that same type of scenario where you have some wind blowing, you need a little bit bigger of a presence, which that color can draw to them. So I'll go a little bit more on a colored up pattern, where if you look at these 2 baits that I brought, they're both pretty natural, dark back, light belly, whereas to get that in a little bit more wind or a little bit more stained water, I might change that opaque belly to something that's a little bit more white, and that back to something that's going to be a little bit more bright, like a brighter green, like almost like a chartreuse type color. Here. So like this is Copperfield. So it's not a super gaudy color by any means, but it has a little bit more of that color to it that can sometimes draw some bites to you. And in both of those terms, I'm still trying to match the forage. I'm just trying to create a either more supernatural presentation with it, or just draw a little bit more power to it. So step 3, this is the most important, and this is what I'm definitely going to spend the most time on. I think regardless of what bait you're going to throw on Geneva, the cadence in the spring is the most important. So one of my favorite baits to throw in the pre-spawn when they're shallow is a ball head jig with a paddle tail swim bait. So that's similar to this one I just showed you here, the 3.3 Kitech. So I'm usually going to throw that in the shallow situations, not that it won't work in some of the deeper fish, but having that bait slow is the most important thing I can emphasize. When I have clients out on the water, a good way to force yourselves and force them to fish it slow is choosing the correct weight of your jig head and maintaining bottom contact with that jig head. So if you think about it in terms of just gravity and with the way the jig works. So if you put on a 1/2 ounce jig, and I'm telling you the whole time you have to maintain bottom contact. You're in 10 foot of water, it's pretty easy to wind that thing pretty quick and still get it to tick, 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 tick on the bottom, and it's gonna be moving pretty quick. But I switch that up to a 3/16 ounce head, and I tell you only reel it if you're feeling the bottom. So when you start winding that thing, it's light, it's not gonna lift off. So stop it. You wanna keep it on the bottom. So a lot of times the cadence that I'm using with a ball head with a paddle tail, which is always a staple on Geneva in the spring, it's just almost half a reel turn, is stop feeling that rock, stop. Half a reel turn, stop. It's almost like when you drag bottom with a football jig and you're kind of dragging, then you feel that tick tick and set the hook into them. Same concept, but with the spinning rod and the finesse application. So you're just wind, let it sit, wind, And it's going to typically be a bite when you're on slack line. So you'll see your line jump a little bit, or you feel a little tick, and you can pull into them. So that's a technique that if you're going to throw one bait, in my opinion, on Geneva, it's creeping that swim bait. And it's going to be a similar application when you're throwing that football jig. So for the 2 bottom contact baits that we talked about, same idea. You're going to cast it out, just drag bottom with that football jig, give it pauses in between, and be able to set the hook on them. The other 2 baits that we mentioned were fishing above their head. So that would be the jerk bait and like a straight tail minnow. So in contrast with each other, I typically am always going to be throwing this, like I said, on forward-facing sonar. It's a little bit more applicable, but if you're not going to be using that, a bait that can really shine for you when you're fishing above their head is going to be a jerk bait. It's going to keep you in the correct strike zone, and typically if you choose either 110 junior or a 110 or a +1, it's going to change that depth. So if you're fishing in 10 foot, you can always keep it above their head with a normal 110. If you're fishing in 15, you'll still be able to keep it above their head. But it's just about kind of reading their behavior with everything and trying to get the right cadence. So in the spring, like we talked about with water temperature, it can be slow sometimes with how those fish are moving in the cold water. So that's where a jerk bait is going to shine by giving you long pauses. Just give it a snap, let it sit 5-10 seconds, give it a snap, let it sit 5-10 seconds. And then on the flip side of that, if you're fishing and they're chasing bait around, you're trying to get them to react to something, you don't also just forget about fishing it fast as well too. That's where you're gonna be, which is kind of a staple in smallmouth fishing, is fishing a jerk bait super, super fast, getting them to fly up on it, fight over it with each other. But it's about mixing in those cadences and going between that super, super slow and that super, super fast, which is typically how I'm gonna generate most of my bites on Geneva. And how many of you guys fish with forward-facing sonar? Okay, so I've been wholly out on some of that. I'm not sure how many of you guys use it. So a huge thing for me in the spring and in general is reading body language on forward-facing sonar. So it's not just seeing a fish, casting to him, working it, oh, he didn't bite. I want to watch my bait and see how he positively and negatively reacts to it, and then you can make your adjustments with your cadence from there. So with the bottom contact, it's pretty simple. I'm always going to be fishing it slow like that. But anything I'm fishing above their head, I'm really trying to watch these fish and see how they react to my bait and make changes based upon that. So if I see a fish, he's flying up after it, stopping, flying up after it, stopping it. When I'm fishing this jerk bait, I'm typically going to speed up that cadence, not give them a chance to kind of look at it and then, oh, it darted away again. I'm going to come up to it and look at it again. And then on the flip side of that, if I see a fish and I'm working it at him and he's coming up to it super slow, and I'm kind of getting that jerk bait further away from him and he wasn't closing the distance, that's where I'm going to use the first cadence I talked about, that super slow. Just kind of get him to like look at it, give it a little twitch, and just as he comes up to it, get him to react to it. So utilizing that forward-facing sonar whenever you're targeting suspended fish or fish where you're going to be throwing a bait that's above their head is super, super key. And the same way you would fish that minnow, you're doing kind of the same thing. You're reading their body language to determine not the jerk bait necessarily and the cadence that you're going to exactly use. It's more the weight of that ball head that you're going to throw this minnow on. So if you have that lazy fish that you're working it away from him at a normal speed and he's kind of just lazy following it, doesn't want to commit to it, which a lot of smallmouth will do. They'll just follow it, get to the boat, swim back down to the bottom. That's where I'm going to lighten up my jig head so I don't have to work it to the boat as quickly. I can throw like an 1/8 ounce or a 1/16 ounce, even in some of the deeper water, and I'll be able to shake that minnow and just keep it rolling in place, and not letting it drop below him, not work it too far away from him, just slowly keeping it in front of him until he gets to eat it. Where on the flip side of that, like the jerk bait, we're going to work it fast with the fish that's all fired up, sometimes going to a slightly heavier head, which in terms of the straight tail minnow is never going to be super heavy for me. The heaviest I'm going to go is going to be a 1/4 ounce. So then you're able to kind of shape that minnow, work it up, and away from them at a quicker speed without it just rising directly to the surface. So it's all about just reading your fish behavior with those ones that are higher up. And a bait that I haven't really talked about yet, when you're fishing above their head that a lot of people don't throw as well, is a football jig. So it's kind of, everyone fishes bottom with a football jig. This is a bait that can be extremely, extremely productive when you're fishing, swimming it essentially above their head through the water column. So on Geneva, that's another bait you can kind of mess with, and it's going to be that same cadence deal where you're just kind of reading their body language, and if it's a fish that's slow following it, just going to kind of wind it and give it snaps and just try to get them to more react to it at that slow line, whereas you can almost stroke the jig when they're in an aggressive mood, but not how you would in grass. Just suspend it in the water column, stroke that jig, and get them to react to it, similar to how you would with like a rattle trap, fishing it through grass for pre-spawn small or pre-spawn large.
What are you tipping it with?
So you can do a variety of baits, and that also comes down to water temperature for me mostly. So it's going to be more action I want from the bait when the water starts to warm up. So for me, that's a max scent chigger claw is a bait that I like to throw a lot. It has big claws on it, create a lot of vibration, move a lot of water, so that when they're in that true feeding mode, when that water is getting into those upper 40s, like, and they're really starting to bite, that's when I'm going to be throwing something that creates all that action and draws them in and gets them to commit to it. Whereas if I'm throwing it in a week or two from now, when that water is still super, super cold, I'm trying to always find a bait that has minimal action. So something like, I love max scent on Lake Geneva, so I'll throw the little trooper as a jig trailer. I'll throw a super trooper, which is that same little Ned bait, but it has little tiny cup claws on it. You can throw a paddle tail swim bait, which is in my opinion, a jig trailer that's slept on quite a bit, especially with clear bodies of water. It creates enough movement in the water to move a little bit and draw power and look realistic in the water, but it's not going to be those obnoxious, huge flapping claws that fish is not going to want to chase when that water is cold. But you can kind of just mess around with variations of that. It's mainly just understanding warmer water, more movement, colder water, a little bit less movement with that bait. So I talked about these as we went through everything. The jerk bait is going to be the bait that shines in the wind. These are stuff I throw at suspended fish. But one bait I didn't really touch on much during that was a hair jig. Any of you guys throw a hair jig for smallies?
I have a question. Is that variable hair?
So one of my favorite, I grabbed this one from my boat. I'm not sure exactly what this one is, but my favorite type of fur is rabbit fur for a hair jig. You can find a lot of different hair jigs on the market, and you can kind of tell when you fish it which one's going to be a good one or not. And the two things I kind of look for, because honestly, like you look at them in the store, they all kind of look the same. Like it's hard to tell if you're not super into hair jigs, which one should I buy, which one's going to actually produce some fish. The two things that are always most key are like every bait having a good hook and a good head on. It's not going to fall apart. It's going to land fish for you. But beyond that, having hair that expands properly in the water. So when you drop it down, whether you're from shore or on your boat and you look at it in the water, you want that hair to have some movement to it and not just look like a wet dog in the water. You don't want it to just be flat doing nothing. You want it to have some pulsing when you move it and look like a lifelike bait in the water. And on top of that, you want something that still retains water. Because when I'm throwing a hair jig, I'm throwing a super, super light hair jig. So it's already hard to cast. You can have the perfect setup. I threw mine on a 7.6 medium light or an 8-foot medium light, throwing 5-pound braid on it with a 5 or 6-pound fluorocarbon leader. So that allows you to get that casting distance. But even with that, it's hard to cast these baits. So you want a fur, rabbit fur, like I said, is my favorite. It retains a little bit of water. So when you pick it up and you go to cast it, it's going to have a little bit extra water like left in that fur. So it's going to add to that casting distance. But it's still going to be a fur that expands really, really well in the water. And one little tip you can do too, I think I have one on here, it's rusted on this hook because I left it in my boat. Right there is a Max Scent General, and it's a tiny little piece that I cut off and just shove all the way up on the shank of that hook. It adds a little bit of scent to your bait, and also it adds just, when you're talking how light these hair jigs are, that little bit of just Max Scent plastic on there adds a little bit weight that's not going to change the action of your bait, to help you get that casting distance with it as well too. So with the presentation of the hair jig, I'm going to throw it in slick, calm water. So we talked about the jerk bait, reading their body language, everything like that. Same deal with this, but I'm just going to be reeling it. Nothing fancy to it. if you're utilizing forward-facing sonar, it's a great bait to throw as well. You see that fish out there, he's not reacting to anything. It's slick calm, which can be really, really tough on Geneva. You're gonna grab this bait, whip it out there, try to get it past him a little bit, and just keep it above his head. No action, nothing, just straight line. Just reel it right above his head, and you'll feel it. It almost just, you'll see him following it, and it's never like when I'm throwing it, it seems like it's never an aggressive bite when I'm throwing it on Geneva. It's not like they see it, they fly up and they crush it. It's just you see them lazy follow, and then all of a sudden those dots kind of meet, and your rod just loads up a little bit. So it's all about just keep fishing it super, super slow and keeping it at that speed where you're just barely keeping it away from them. And picking the right jig head is kind of key for that. Just as we talked about with the minnow, you go too heavy to keep it above their head, you have to go too fast with it. You pick one that's too light, and you're going to be waiting forever if they're a little bit deeper to get it down to them. You're not going to be able to cast it to them. So for me, regardless, pretty much at depth I'm fishing, a 3/32 ounce hair jig is going to be something that's always tied on in the spring for me, regardless of where I'm fishing. If I'm targeting smallmouth, yeah, 3/32 it's like a good medium ground, because you go to a 1/16, sometimes it's not enough. You go to that, and it doesn't seem like much too, going from a 3/32 to an 1/8 being a difference, but it seems like that 1/8 sometimes can be a little bit too heavy, because I'm trying to utilize this hair jig as my ultra finesse bait on Geneva. It's something that they don't want to bite anything. This is a bait that they're going to bite. One bait I didn't mention out here as well too, that kind of comes into the same category for me on Geneva of slick calm, days they don't want to bite anything, is a spy bait. A spy bait's kind of known everywhere as a smallmouth killer, but I don't see a lot of people utilizing it on Geneva. Similar to hair jig, it seems like everyone throws this on the Great Lakes for smallmouth, but people seem to forget about it on Geneva, which is a clear body of water, similar to the Great Lakes, especially in the spring where you have fish presenting shallow, and the spy bait's kind of filling that same void. Does anyone not know what a spy bait is? So a spy bait, essentially, if you imagine the body profile of a jerkbait, and it has a spinning prop on the back, a spinning prop on the front, and it's a sinking bait. So it's not a prop bait. It's going to have a slow sink to it, and it's going to look like you drag it by your boat. It's going to look like it's doing nothing. It's going to look like you have a broken jerkbait. It's just going straight by. But that's kind of the whole point of it. Similar to that hair jig, it's that subtle action on those days where they don't want to bite anything, that you're going to get them to bite a bait like that. All it's going to do, cast it out, same deal as that hair jig. No jerking that bait, no ripping it super fast and stopping it, just that slow, steady wind. And all it's going to do, most of the ones, if you buy a good one, like my favorite one is a Duo Realis spy bait, and it's going to have a slow body roll to it with those little props just spinning on it. So it's just going to be a super subtle little bait fish presentation that's going to kind of go hand in hand with that hair jig on those slick calm days. So for the minnow, we talked about the jig weight and how that kind of relates to how these fish are following your bait and how you can get them to react to it based on your jig head. But one thing we didn't really talk about was that minnow size. So like you mentioned, matching the bait in the lake, that's something that can be super, super key at times, and sometimes you get lost in the crowd and you're not going to get bit on it. So most of these perch on Geneva, when they get up on these flats, are going to be little 3-inch perch. And don't get me wrong, you can throw a 3-inch spark shad, a 3-inch Kitech, 100% catch fish on it. But if you ever find a day where you're not getting bit on that, or you're seeing a crazy amount of bait, like I'm sure some of you guys, if you fish Geneva in the spring, you went to reel your bait in and you just have that big ball of tiny little perch following it all the way to your boat. So sometimes when there's that many perch, it's easy pickings for them with which ones they're going to eat. So you start working your bait around them, and they're like, they decide in a split second they don't want to eat it, and it moved a little away, they're not going to eat it anymore. But giving them a slightly bigger presentation can sometimes trigger those bites, because you have to think about it in terms of they have to eat however many small minnows to get the same amount of nutrients they would have one big bait. So they spend a little bit of energy to go get that big one, or they feed for the next 30 minutes on all these little ones that are down there. So sometimes not only just giving them a bigger presentation is going to draw them in, but it seems like it actually gets them to eat it. Like I feel like a lot of people get the idea if you ever throw a glide bait or anything like that for bass, like that big bait gets a lot of presence in the water, it gets a lot of fish to look at it, but it's hard to get them to bite that. I feel like with smallmouth, for whatever reason, especially on Geneva, it may seem counterintuitive, but throwing on a bigger bait actually not just draws them in, it gets them to commit to it. There's so many times on Geneva, not just in the spring, but year round, where I'll be throwing at smallmouth with what I feel like is a perfect little smallmouth bait, same size as all the bait I'm seeing, the same stuff they're eating, and they follow it, they look at it, but then they just, I don't want to turn off. And you go up on that size, and all of a sudden you throw back into that school, you throw back at that fish, and that same fish looks at it and he doesn't think twice, he just flies up and eats it. I truly don't know exactly the reason behind. My theory is, like I said, they see a bigger meal and they want to capitalize on that opportunity sometimes, but it's without a doubt when you put on a bigger bait on certain days, those smallmouth go from completely inactive to wanting to fire on it. So when I say big bait, that's something else that can be up for interpretation. So this is a Crush City freeloader. This is a 5.25 inch bait. So this would be where I start in terms of smallmouth. This would be where I start to determine this is a bigger minnow. But you can go up to a 6, 6.5. So anything that's in that class of like 4 to 3 to even smaller, I would consider a small minnow. So you might think, oh, I got this big 4-inch plastic on, they're still not eating it. Going up and up in size, sometimes it may seem weird, especially when I have clients on my boat and I'm like, these smallmouth don't want to eat a little bait. Let's put on a 6-inch minnow and see if they eat it. It seems like naturally, like you wouldn't think like if they don't want to eat a small presentation, why would they eat some giant one? But it really does get them to eat it. So I'll go all the way up to a 6-inch Sakamata shad and a 5-inch spark shad sometimes. It's just messing around on those days when you're not getting those bites. So we talked about this as well too, the bottom contact. My favorite baits for throwing that paddle tail, which I can't emphasize enough how much that is one of my go-to baits on Geneva. If you're going to go out there in the spring and only throw one bait, it's going to be a paddle tail with a 3/16 at the max, a quarter head ball head. And like I was saying, just that slow wind creeping it on the bottom. So same deal, size, mess around with it. Sometimes they want that small profile, but don't be afraid to go to a bigger size. I'm typically not going to go crazy big on a bottom contact bait. Once again, I don't know 100% the reason why. I just know from being out there a ton and doing it, it seems like it's easier to get them to go up and chase a bigger bait than it is when you're creeping it on the bottom. And it might be something to do with water temperature. It doesn't seem like there's a rhyme or reason, because certain days they'll chase it when it's high up in a big bait, small bait, but on the bottom it seems like they want it to be a smaller profile. And one of my favorite go-to baits is a high-tech Swing Impact. It's a bait that has a lot of color options, has a lot of very neutral color options as well, so you have a lot of options for what you're going to throw on Geneva to try to imitate that just natural profile. And typically for me, that's going to be just a slightly darker back and kind of an opaque belly. It's something that imitates a lot of the bait fish in there, and especially those perch that they're caning in on. Jig we talked about, so I mentioned swimming it, but obviously dragging that jig is going to be super productive as well. Like any type of condition you do, largemouth or smallmouth, you'll catch them dragging a jig. So my two go-to jigs on Geneva is going to be a Gentleman's Club jig. Have any of you guys ever heard of this brand before? Okay, perfect. That's why I brought it, because this is a jig that people seem like they forgot about on Geneva. It's has anyone heard of dem jigs? No one's heard of dem jigs. So John DeMay was a hammer on Geneva for a long time, and he was kind of his staple was catch him on a football jig. And he would catch them dragging it as well as swimming it, as I was talking about before. And he developed dem jigs, which was kind of a jig that was made specifically for not just smallmouth but largemouth on Geneva as well. And he ended up selling the company. They stopped making the jig, and it was impossible to get them for a long time. So everyone kind of, a few years ago, everyone would fight over it. Everyone wanted one of these jigs. And one of my buddies, bought the patent from them and started making these jigs again. So it's essentially the same exact jig. The features that make this jig super important mainly are the hook and the line tie. But another awesome feature about it has a screw lock on it. So you're catching a lot of fish in the spring, like I mentioned. it gets expensive to go through plastics. No one wants to go through bags and bags, especially MaxScent gets to be kind of pricey. So the screw lock honestly like kind of doubles that, but the key aspect of this jig that makes it so important, I'll pass this around and let you guys kind of look at it afterwards because it's hard to kind of see from far away. But it has a decoy hook on it. So we can pull this back a little bit. The line tie goes slightly back, pointed towards that hook. So what that does is smallmouth can be a little bit hard to pin sometimes. Like you get a bite, oh, nothing's there. You get a bite, nothing's there. And that line tie, when you pull on it, it almost acts as like a snelled hook. So when you pull on it, it pulls that hook up and forward into the roof of their mouth. So that combined with that awesome decoy hook, like it's a game changer on Geneva. And they also, since it's specifically made for Geneva, they have all the incredible colors. They have a ton of them made with living rubber, which can be awesome in a clear body of water when you're trying to finesse fish and fish them slow. But I couldn't believe no one's heard of dumb jigs. That's a staple on Geneva. How about a tightrope jig? Has anyone heard of that? Ryan Whitaker makes these jigs. It's an awesome jig. So this will be something, I'll throw that Gentleman's Club jig all the time, year round in the spring, windy, not windy, dirty, cleaner. It doesn't really make a difference to me. It's a jig that I just have a lot of confidence in, and I feel like I can always catch fish on it. But in terms of size and presentation, sometimes a tightrope jig can be something that shines. It's a little bit different of a profile. It's a spider cut skirt. It has a wire weed guard, so it's a little bit more finesse of a bait. It's a smaller profile in the water. It doesn't draw as much as that big Gentleman's Club jig with the living rubber moving all over the place. So in the same terms of changing cadence, changing the size of your minnow, sometimes downsizing to a more small profile jig can be something that works really well. It's also not a football head jig, it's a ball head jig. So it's one of my favorite jigs to throw a paddle tail on. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that's one of the most underutilized baits as a jig trailer, especially on a clean body of water like Geneva. You're dragging bottom with that ball head with just the paddle tail, but sometimes same thing as going up a size in a minnow, putting it on a jig and dragging it on a ball head jig instead of just that bare ball head hook can be something that generates some bites as well too. So that's one that I like to throw a lot on Geneva.
Question?
Yes, sir.
How are you attaching the crayfish to your?
Oh, perfect. I didn't even.
Where you hooking the crayfish?
So for the sea rig, when I throw that, that's what you're talking about.
I'm just talking about where are you putting the hook through the bait?
Yeah. So the picture I have here on the screen, that's a MaxScent Berkeley Krug Craw. So I actually forgot to mention this technique as we were talking. So I throw it mainly in the spring on a Carolina rig. So a Carolina rig, you got your little bullet weight about 18 or so inches from your bait, even a little bit further sometimes, and I have that hooked on a worm hook. So that's another thing that a lot of guys kind of make them, not necessarily a mistake of, but something where you end up not hooking as many fish as you're trying to, is by putting it on an EWG hook. It's super common. A lot of guys put it on an EWG hook. I'd say most guys probably do. But the thing is with the worm hook, it's so much tighter to your bait profile that it doesn't cause a drag or any water catching on it as you're dragging it through the water.
Put right the tail of the crayfish.
So I'm Texas rigging it on that bait, but I'm going to nose hook it and thread it back weedless through that bait. But instead of using a wide gap EWG hook, I'm going to rig it on a worm hook. Because that big wide gap on it, on that worm hook, is going to hit on the bottom, it's going to drag water, and it's actually going to cause that bait to spin, which one is going to look a little bit unnatural in the water. This goes for any time you're throwing a Carolina rig too. And putting that worm hook on it that has that more like straight kind of bend to it, it's not going to have that huge wide gap, is going to cause that bait to not spin so much underwater. Which
that's what I'm trying to figure out, is how you get that thing to not spin.
So a worm hook makes a huge difference.
Okay, that's
worm hook, and
you're going through the tail and up through the.
Yep. So
how are you actually hooking? That's what I'm trying
yeah.
to
So Texas rig.
So it doesn't spin. That's the key. That's
yeah,
what I'm
yeah.
trying to figure out.
So like, do you mind if I take one out of here?
Go ahead.
Sure. So if I had that, I don't think I have any hooks up here, but if I was going to take this crawfish right here, just Texas rig it, so put that hook point right through the back of it, turn it back around, and hook it up through that bait. So your hook is sitting that direction, you're gonna pull it like that.
Okay, got it.
And just by using that worm hook, it's going to cause, obviously, anything like that you're dragging freely is going to have a little bit of spin to it, but that worm hook seems like it decreases it like quite a bit. And not only is that going to help it make it look more natural in the water, it's also going to help with hookup ratios, because if you have that bait upside down, you have more of a chance that that fish is not going to get pinned really good. And fishing a Carolina rig, if any of you guys do it a lot, you already know like hookup ratios can be kind of tough with it sometimes. You don't have direct contact to your bait. The bait's typically super far away when you're casting it. You have so much stretch between you and that fluorocarbon that trying to maximize something, it doesn't seem like it's a huge deal. Changing that hook can actually help with hookups quite a bit. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I didn't talk about a Carolina rig. I forgot to grab one, so it slipped my mind. But that's a bait that I'll throw quite a bit in the spring as well too, as a bottom contact bait. It's a little bit more subtle, so that would be like the counterpart to me throwing a jig, is throwing a Carolina rig. It's going to kind of fit the same category and target the same type of fish that are set up tight to the bottom. They want a bottom contact bait, but it's going to be a little bit more subtle of a presentation. So with that, I'm typically throwing it on a 1/2 ounce. Sometimes I'll go down to a 1/4. Just I want that 1/2 ounce, cover a lot of water, and just slow drag it with my rod and just fish it super, super slow. And as that gentleman was asking before with the plastic that I'm going to throw on it, it comes into that same category. As the water warms up, I'm going to put a little bit more action of a profile onto it, like a chigger craw. And as it's a little bit colder water, I'm going to have a little bit more subtle of a presentation, not just for the movement, but I can drag it even slower and create a little bit of movement. So my favorite bait for that would be Zoom Speed Craw or a Missile Baits Baby Destroyer. And that's a bait that has super thin, long tentacles on it, so it doesn't take much water moving on it to get that bait to kind of have some bit of action. So I can drag that super, super slow and know that bait's still doing a little bit of work down in the water as well for me. So it comes down to water temperature for the plastic for it, but in general, I'm never really varying my speed too drastically with that sea rig. I'm going to change more of my bait. A lot of times I still want that slow presentation, because that's kind of the category you're trying to cover when you're throwing that Carolina rig. And that's kind of my go-to baits for Lake Geneva. I'll throw a variety of stuff, not just the only baits that I'll throw, but if I had to pick a handful of baits that I'm going to throw on Geneva and kind of the applications for them, it just comes down to one, finding the fish, finding the warm water, finding the bait, and then determining if they're suspended, if they're tight to the bottom, and then if they want to come up and chase something, or if they just want something dried down to the bottom. So once you kind of find those fish, throwing a handful of baits, you can usually figure it out pretty quickly and kind of just stick with that and then make small variations. That's always my biggest thing with guide trips, or if I'm fishing myself, it's just kind of sticking with something, changing it with small variations once you get one bite. So it's like you get a bite dragging, you're not getting any more, kind of make little changes throughout it just to kind of figure out if it's something you're close to it but you're not quite there with stuff. Kind of quick and went over a lot, but tried to cover everything I do on Geneva.
You mentioned you use a fiber line with a fluorocarbon leader.
Yeah, so that's...
What is that fluorocarbon do for you?
So, can you say your question one more time?
Yeah, you use a braid line and then you have fluorocarbon leader.
Yeah, so...
What does that fluorocarbon do for you in that setup?
So on Geneva, if you're throwing a spinning rod, all my rods always are rigged up with braid for the casting distance of it mainly. But the fluorocarbon leader is going to do a couple things for you on Geneva. One, it's going to make sure your line is not visible to these fish. They're super, super smart, especially the smallmouth on Geneva. They see braid attached to that bait, and it's going to be something put on like a 20-foot leader, but they're keying in on that bait. You're trying to convince them the best you can, especially with a fish that's smart. So that's one aspect of it, is just to conceal your bait a little bit. And then the second aspect is braid has virtually no abrasion resistance to it. And it's not so much like Lake Michigan where you have tons of chunk rock and stuff like that you're fishing, you're gonna get frayed on zebra mussels. But all those cribs out on Geneva, even some of the grass, once it starts to grow up, that gets that zebra mussels all over it, you're gonna want something that's gonna have a little bit of abrasion resistance and kind of fray up a little bit instead of just you get bit and right next to it and just clean break off as that braid just cuts. And then each of these baits are going to kind of have different applications line-wise, but on a spinning rod on Geneva, you can get away with, if you don't want to have all these different setups, everything like that for each specific bait, you can throw a 10-pound braid with a 10-pound fluorocarbon leader, 12-pound fluorocarbon leader in the spring, and be perfectly fine. I don't super downsize my line like I do in the summer when I'm fishing those deep smallies where I'm throwing 5 to 7 pound leader for some of those smallies that are set up real deep in the summer. In the spring on Geneva, it seems like you get away with that 10 and 12 pound perfectly fine.
Randy, I take you to ice fish.
I do ice fish.
So do you have an ice shanty on Geneva?
So I don't run any of my dry trips on Geneva through the ice. I spend all my time essentially from October until April on Lake Michigan. So I'm doing the brown trout.
Do you go ice fishing where?
On Lake Michigan.
On Lake Michigan.
Yeah, so I don't, if I have time.
Lake Michigan is pretty big.
Yeah, so I mostly do the harbors in Wisconsin. So like Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee, Sheboygan. So in those harbors, and I'm fishing for brown trout, steelhead. I'll try to get out to Geneva and ice fish if I get some free time, but typically I'm pretty full that time of year, but I love going out to Geneva and ice
So
fishing.
you're out there in Lake Michigan, do you have some sort of a shelter that you provide?
Yeah, so we'll, depending on the group size, we'll have multiple shanties set up with live scopes in them and jig for the brown trout, and as well as we have jaw jackers, so like an automatic hook setting device that will set out all over the harbor and target those browns. And that's the same thing we're doing now on the boat too.
Do you provide Dubois blackberry brandy?
Extra charge.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, we're talking smallmouth, respawn. What time of the year?
So typically, if I had to pick my favorite time for pre-spawn on Geneva, it's going to be around the end of April, May. That's when they're going to be in that water temperature that I was talking about before. It's starting to warm up, and it's not warm by any means, but it's starting to get more solidly into that warming trend, and they're going to be found in that shallower 10 to 15 foot. Before that, I'm talking like now until mid-April, end of April, typical years, the majority of those fish you're going to find are going to be in that deeper 25 to 35.
Are the smallmouth in competition with any other species for the beds?
Not necessarily. The walleye a little bit. I mean, that has a little bit, not even really. The walleye spawn before that too much on Geneva. There's not much overlap with beds. The largemouth will reuse smallmouth beds a lot of times, and they'll kind of maybe have a little bit of overlap, but the majority of it's, when you find smallmouth on beds, it's pretty much just going to be smallmouth, and those largemouth are still going to be in that stage where they're not on beds, they're starting to be around those areas. I don't know if you've been out on Geneva like mid to late May where you see a ton of largemouth shallow, but they won't bite anything. They just kind of, they're not on beds either, they're just cruising. They're kind of, typically when the smallmouth are on the tail end of the spawn, the largemouth are in that weird, just floating around the shallow water waiting to kind of get onto a bed. And that's when that hair jig is about the only thing that'll catch those largemouth that are just floating there. You could pretty much poke them with your rod and they'll take off then, but a hair jig is something you can catch those ones on.
So you say the walleye is earlier, is that like April?
Yeah, like end of April-ish, like mid to end of April-ish. If you want to find out if they're on beds, you can go to Cedar Point and just look around, and you'll see if the walleye are on beds. It loads,
Really?
yeah,
Shallow water?
yeah, it loads with them right on Cedar. But typically, it's going to be before the smallmouth, and it'll kind of. There can be, of course, some little overlap, but for the most part, it's going
But
to
the
be
respawn
smallmouth.
bite would probably be earlier April?
For the walleye, yeah, definitely. So it'd be like that.
And